I'm going to focus on the work that I'm bringing to you all today, which is about, as the title suggests, how entertainment journalists manage online hate and harassment, done with my fine collaborators at the University of Maryland, although I am now at Oberlin College as a visitor. For those of you familiar with the sort of traditional literature on usable security and journalists, thinking of Susan McGregor's work and many other folks, we know that in general, like a lot of the journalists that have often been studied so far are folks who work in some kind of formal institution, right, for a major newspaper or news organization of some kind, and are in general working against nation-state adversaries, right? The government of a foreign country wants to know what you're doing because for whatever reason that might be. Now, on the other hand, some more recent work, like from Kurt Thomas and Miranda Way and others, has been focusing on content creators, so people like Twitch streamers and YouTubers, who don't have this kind of institutional support. The largest streamers have teams that are probably not more than, I would guess, 5 to 10 people at the absolute maximum for the very most successful ones. And their sort of digital safety concern is day-to-day harassment rather than this kind of nation-state interference. So the population I'm going to talk about today has some characteristics of both. So I'm going to be talking about an interview study that I did with entertainment journalists. So what I'm referring to is people who cover movies, TV, video games, or something like that. Initially inspired by Gamergate was my sort of first into this community, who do, in most cases, work for formal institutions, newsrooms or websites or things like that. But their digital safety concern is, in fact, harassment. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the research questions for this project were: how do entertainment journalists manage harassment? How is this harassment impacted by risk events? How does institutional support play a role in how they deal with this threat? And how do contextual risk factors impact this? Referencing some of my own prior work here. And of course, time limited, we're going to talk about these 3 research questions. So in order to do this, I sent almost 200 cold emails and Twitter DMs, as you can imagine. A random person reaching out and wanting to talk about some of the worst things that have happened to you does take some convincing, which meant that also once I got a few people willing to participate, did a lot of snowball sampling in order to get people to be like, yes, this is a real person who is not just trying to get dirt on you. And so I started with game journalists, again, with Gamergate being something I was already familiar with, and many of you all will be as well. But those participants actually recommended sports journalists as people who also experience similar levels of harassment. So I talked to some of those as well, doing 9 interviews total. And then we did reflexive thematic analysis, inspired by, of course, Braun and Clark's excellent book, which if you haven't checked it out, I would highly recommend. This is not a paid sponsorship. So the first group of themes that I'm going to talk about is the sort of like context that these folks are working in, and then we'll talk about their strategies for mitigation later on. And so, of course, all of these themes are more fully described in the paper. I'm going to focus on these 2 to start with. So the first thing is that all of our participants express harassment is what the inevitable price of admission to this industry, right? If you're going to do this job, you're going to get harassed. Congratulations. And this kind of existed on a spectrum of specific events. So on sort of one end, we might consider things that are a little bit less individually impactful but constant, things that they hear every day, like insulting their intelligence or their qualifications. For example, participant 7 said, for like 3 days I got people on Twitter yelling at me, and then in 3 days it goes away because the people yelling at me don't know who I am. And then in the middle, we have more serious threats like doxing or slurs and hate speech. And I'm not making a claim as a result that this graph is perfectly correct, but I just want to give you a sense for what we're talking about here. And so one participant said, people out there have my address after they got doxed, and all it takes is one person to have the wrong idea, and because I didn't lock my screen door, someone could just come into the house. And then finally, we have the highest escalation death threats, swatting and bomb threats. Anita Sarkeesian famously was prevented from making a speech at an institution in, I think, 2015 because of bomb threats from Gamergate supporters. And what our participants also pointed out is that white cisgender maleness functions as a shield to protect them from even worse harassment. And I say appearing for a reason here, which we'll come back into a second. And they all had this idea that like other folks had it worse. So we actually didn't talk to any women in this study, which is an admitted limitation, but also I think considered the method of recruitment, right? A random person reaches out to you, maybe you don't want to talk about that. But all of our participants, despite that, knew that, okay, women, trans people, folks of color, they all have it worse than I do. And our participants who were people of color did receive harassment based on their race and presentation. One participant, for example, I will add hateful words to the list of muted words so I don't see them randomly when I'm tweeting about sports or current events or something like that. And what I want to emphasize is that presentation is more important than identity, right? So one participant in particular had a more complex gender identity than simply being a man, but the people who are doing this harassment aren't like looking very carefully at the pronouns in your bio, right? Like they're not taking that time, so it's just first blush, right? If you happen to present this way, then great, you're protected. If not, well, then it becomes worse. As another example, participant 7 said, because of my name and because a lot of Americans don't realize that Brazilians can be white too, or white-ish, they'll feel very comfortable saying something anti-Mexican to me before realizing, oh hey, he's an immigrant kid too. So, from that context that these journalists are working in, let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies that they use to deal with this harassment. I'm preferring depth over breadth for this particular presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is the common advice of just ignore it, don't feed the trolls, right? That's probably something you all have heard, which they sort of see as the best worst option. And so what do I mean by that? The general stated goal of the harassers, at least from the perspective of our participants, is to get a rise out of you. If you respond in an emotional way, then they have won. So don't give them what they want, right? And this interacts with platform features of Twitter. It was still called Twitter when I did this study. So blocking is discoverable, so maybe you don't want to do that because they'll be like, yes, badge of honor, but muting is silent, so that's more common. And then as a broader thing, stepping away from the screen entirely, right? Like admitting that, okay, well, this still is fundamentally online, so let me rely on my personal connections and just take a break. But at the same time, many of our participants express considerable ambivalence about this, right? Like, what if there was a real threat, right? What if somebody did have my address? What if I actually did need to take action? So, and they didn't really have a clear way to answer that question, right? Like, how do I know which one is which without experiencing that harassment directly? That's the only way that I have to do it. So they had very mixed feelings about this. Another critical avenue of survival strategies here, though, is external support. So I sort of break that into two categories. One, concrete assistance, right? This is where the institutional support comes in through legal teams or harassment response teams, or slightly more informal mechanisms like giving your phone to a coworker to triage your notifications for 3 days so that you don't have to look at it yourself. And although it'll still be intense for them, less so than things that are directly targeted at themselves. On the other hand, emotional support was also critical. I would say just as critical as this in some ways. Many participants talked about that value of having a newsroom of other people who had experienced something like you to commiserate with and suggest different strategies, learning from others on what to do, and then, if necessary, seeking therapy and mental support. Mental health support, I should say. Although this was surprisingly ineffective, one therapist told a participant that they didn't have a mental illness, so they couldn't help them with this problem, which is not something I would not think very highly of that therapist, personally. So what I want to sort of suggest here is that we have a status quo of personal responsibility that requires individual action to deal with this problem. And although external support is critical, it's inconsistent, right? Like, if you don't happen to be in a newsroom that has a harassment response team, well, then what happens, right? What do you do? What if you are new to the field and you don't have those network connections yet that allow you to get support from other people with a similar experience to you? And so I would like to imagine a future as a suggestion for where we could go next, where this personal responsibility shifts to a collective responsibility, right? Rather than one individual against a collective of harassers. I would like to see individual action be supported by societal reduction of burden, ideally at the platform level, but I don't know about you, I'm not particularly optimistic about X changing their policies on harassment anytime soon. This idea of external support being critical but inconsistent suggests that one fruitful way to make progress on this is to make that external support more equitable and more consistent, regardless of people's positioning and experience in this particular industry and other related contexts. So, to sum it up, entertainment journalists experience severe harassment, and their current solutions are non-technical, getting help from others, stepping away from the screen. Maybe they use platform affordances, but they're not using particular technologies in order to accomplish this problem. A common strategy is to ignore it and move on, although that has some downsides as well. And this is them taking individual action against a collective problem. All right. That's most of the talk, except I have the obligatory I'm on the job market, please go to my website slide. But also, there is a survey, which is very short. This is not an IRB approved survey. It's just asking you if you could have one human-centered security paper that you would like an undergraduate class to read, which I am teaching, let me know. The caveat, it can't be written by you. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.